And we have, I don't know how many weeks, really, that we were looking at the subject of living by the book and how to study our Bibles. And it all began sort of a big bird's eye kind of view of the process of Bible study. And so we know that the first step had to be, and we have harped on this over and over the weeks, had to be that we would find out what was actually in the Bible. And we said over and over again that there has been a long-running plague on Sunday school classes where it's all about the middle step, which is interpretation. And so what happens is there's sort of a round robin. Somebody will introduce a subject, and everybody will go around the room and say, well, this is what I think, this is what I think, this is what I think. And the real task is to find out what does God say, and then we find out what did it mean to the people at the time it was given, and then what would it mean for us today. And then we don't drop it there either. We move on to application, and we say, now, what should I be doing with this, and how does it work in my life? So we have been through several different lists of things. We have thought about, for instance, the last time we went through a list, we were looking at our hands and thinking of things emphasized and things that were repeated. And we went all the way down through the list, things that were alike and things that were unlike. And we finally ended up with that final one that said things that are true to life, which is the one that kind of leads us back to application. We try and understand what it is that God wants us to do, because He didn't just give us the Bible so that we could become really sharp at recalling a bunch of facts. And it would be nice if you get on a game show and you can think back to something I taught you. I want to cut. So, if you pick the Bible for 10 billion or something like that, then and you get an answer right, I would like you to remember me. But that's not really the typical situation for us, is it? So, we've looked at a verse. A few weeks ago, we looked at Acts chapter 1, and we only looked at verse 8, and we spent a lot of time on that. I'm trying to think. I think it was just Freddie and Lydia and Cindy and me, and we were upstairs, and we went through the whole thing, and I had the overhead speakers pulled so we wouldn't get feedback up there, and I was on a wireless mic, and apparently about 33 minutes into about an hour of study, my wireless mic cut out, and we didn't hear it because we had the overhead speakers turned off. But later, I would be talking in muffled tones that you wouldn't understand on the video, and then you would hear loud and clear Freddie and Lydia answer, because they were at microphones, wired microphones, and working microphones. So the first half hour of that is still available on YouTube. And then last time, we got into the subject of prayer via Nehemiah and the beginning of Nehemiah, beginning in verse 4, but it sent us back to the beginning of the chapter, as did Acts chapter 1:8 sent us back to Acts chapter 1:1. And so it's interesting that we see that kind of thing happen. But a verse is not the basic unit of study. Verses often get taken out of context and used in all kinds of crazy ways. And then a paragraph, while it's better than a verse, and that's what we did in Nehemiah, is good, and it's at least a complete unit of thought. But a segment is a collection of paragraphs united by a common theme. And so if you would like to take a look in Mark chapter 4, I've got my notes here in New King James. Mark chapter 4 and Mark chapter 5. We will start at the beginning of 4, but really we'll be launching into it at verse 35. So the first part of Mark chapter 4 is the first time he really slows down a little bit. And Jesus is teaching, and we find out, if you've got that open in your Bible someplace, what's the kind of teaching that Jesus is doing, if you have any headings or anything in that part of the Bible.
The parables.
Parables. And it's interesting because if you read right at the very beginning, I'll go ahead and put it up in New King James here. He says in the first 2 verses, he began to teach by the sea, and the great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea. And the whole multitude was on the land facing the sea. And then he taught them many things by parables. And he said to them in his teaching, and so it goes on, he launches into a sower. We're not going to look at that part today, but you need to have that for a context. And the reason is because what's he doing in this first 34 verses? He's teaching. He's teaching by a particular method because he's using parables. Anybody remember an easy definition of what a parable is all about?
Well, this one says telling a story about a familiar thing that we know.
So it has a superficial kind of a meaning that people could grab and they find the analogy, but then it has a spiritual truth buried in it. And so he did have to explain these things, and you'll see that as you get through the rest of the verses there. But we're not going to dwell on that. We're going to hop all the way to the end of this segment and get to verse 33 says, and with many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. And when he says as they're able to hear it, of course, some people understood, some people didn't understand. There were even times when he spoke in parables and his disciples would come and say, the scribes and the Pharisees were listening in, and they didn't much like what you were saying. They didn't really understand all of it, but they understood this, that Jesus was pointing his finger at them. And so that was a problem. And that really caused Jesus not to want to teach to them at all. Is that what happened? He just said, well, okay, I'll tone it down. No, he kept saying what he was going to say to them. And of course, they kept not liking it and put him on a cross. So the second part of this chapter, or a couple of chapters, is the part we're going to look at. And that is Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 35. And we'll go all the way to the end of chapter 5, which is in verse 43. And so if the first part was about teaching and teaching in parables, what is this second portion all about that begins in Mark 4:35?
A series of miracles.
Miracles. And so Jesus is doing something that they can sort of see and believe, really. We're going to see that over and over. So we've got a little note up here to remind us, just like when you're in school, your teacher does some lecturing, and then it's time to do what? What do you have to do to get that grade?
Test.
You take a test. Yes. And so Jesus doesn't give the kind of tests that we probably grew up with, where you just see how much you can cram into your head for the test period, and then you spit it all out, and then you can forget all about it and go on to something else. He's been teaching them, and he wants to make sure. He's been teaching on faith, and he wants to make sure they have any of it. And not just because he wants to know, because he is, after all, the Lord, and he knows exactly what's in a man's heart, but he wants them to be aware of where they stand. So first you have the lecture, and then you have the laboratory. And if we were to begin to look at this passage, beginning in verse 35, and making your way down through the next few verses, what is the first miracle that we see here? The stilling of the storm and the wind, and it says that there's a great windstorm, and waves were breaking over the boat, and the boat was already being swamped, and Jesus was just, on pins and needles and fretting, or what was he doing? He was asleep. And so that particular behavior caused them to do some things that maybe they shouldn't have done. So they woke him up and they said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" And of course, he did care. And I think they were concerned. You got to remember where they were coming from. Mark gets to his business pretty quickly because we're just a couple of pages in. But you're still in chapter 1 after the discussion about John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus and the temptation. Jesus launches in. We're only 14 verses in to chapter 1, 14 verses into the Gospel of Mark, and he's calling disciples, and he's proclaiming the good news, and he's preaching, and then he's doing some pretty phenomenal things. And so, beginning in verse 21 of chapter 1, he's out there teaching, but also a man with an unclean spirit comes along, and he casts this demon out of him. And so by the time we get to verse 29, you find as when they left the synagogue, and by the way, that was the place where they ran into the person with the demon, was at church. And so that should tell you something about the difference between an era when you have the Holy Spirit versus an era when you only had the law. But by 29, we see him coming out of the synagogue, and immediately he heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law, who's got a fever. Sounds like a very relevant kind of topic for our day. And when people saw that he was able to do that, they started bringing people to him. So I want you to think about the disciples riding in the boat here with Jesus. He's asleep, and they might not have thought of him as being all-knowing and aware of things that are going on, but they must have believed at least this much: Jesus can do some miraculous things. He's cast out demons, he's healed people, he's done some things, and so what might he be able to do about this situation? Now keep in mind also, who are a whole bunch of these disciples? What was their trade?
Just commoners.
Well,
Fishermen.
fishermen, yeah. Small business owners, I would like to say, and so that I could relate to them.
You stop and think of nowadays, and we think, it's just difficult to sometimes believe, that he can fix a situation, and yet here the disciples were with him all the time, and they couldn't even do it. And we give up, just like,
This is early, and like I said, he's lecturing, and now he's testing. So the first one is the miracle of the storm, and there's reason for him to start with something like that because it's outside of the realm he had been working in. So he's in command of the elements and that kind of thing. But then he gets into a completely different kind of miracle. And what happens, what's the next miracle that you see there?
Sending the pigs.
Casting out of the demons.
Yeah.
Into the pigs.
So he's already cast a single demon out. What's different about this story?
Legion of them.
A legion, at least that's how they answered, and he did not dispute them on this. And it does say that there was a large herd of pigs, and figured that, a couple of thousand in verse 13. So I don't know if you get a pig per demon, or if a demon can, get a couple of pigs, or if you just get a handful of leaders and get the other pigs to go along for the ride, or whatever it is. Pigs are pretty smart. So I suspect there must have actually been a lot of demons. And so it is the demoniac that he heals in this passage. So he's done something similar to what he's done before, but this is a whole different scale that we're talking about.
Is there any, I don't know what it is, lots of words. With Legionnaire's disease, is there anything that relates to that as far as any, I don't know what Legionnaire's disease was.
No, it's because of the group of people that caused them to investigate it were legionnaires.
Oh, okay.
So, then we have a story, very different kind of a thing also. And so this one is the miracle of the what?
Are you still on the pigs or no?
Past the pigs, we will return to all of them.
Okay.
The girl raised from the dead.
Well,
Blood,
he got met about the girl, but before he could get there,
The lady with the blood problem
yes.
stopped him.
And so she came along and reached out and touched him. And where she got the idea, we don't know, because we don't see any hint of this kind of thing in advance. But she had the faith that it would do something for her. So it is this woman with an issue of blood. And you see that, you see at verse 21, Jesus crossed over back from the demoniac. And the synagogue leader, Jairus, in verse 22, came to ask him about his daughter and wanted him to heal the daughter. But as he was moving toward Jairus' house, the crowd was pressing around him, and that's when this woman just reaches out and makes contact with him. And she's heard about Jesus, but I don't know that she heard that if you would just touch the hem of his garment, something would happen. But it worked. And then, of course, he's on his way to Jairus' house. And what happens with Jairus' daughter?
she died.
She was already dead, in fact, before he could get along. And most likely she would have been dead even if he had hurried on down the street, which may be one reason that he didn't bother. So that takes us all the way. He will raise her by the end of the chapter and then give orders not to spread it around just yet. So now that we have sort of the big idea about what's going on in this passage, we begin to sort of step back and say, it's interesting. This is kind of arranged climatically. So when Jesus stills the storm, that's something bigger than anything that he's done in the prior passages on miracles. And it's a different quality of miracle as well. And so we want to start thinking about those kinds of things. And Jesus is testing them because he's been lecturing on how to have faith and what that faith brings you with the kingdom and so forth. When he gets into the demoniac, we already said, now he's got a whole legion of demons. And so that's even bigger than stilling the storm. And then when we get to the woman, we've got somebody who has had a serious issue and has spent all of her money, all of her time, 12 years of suffering like this, separated from people. And so he keeps adding to the list. And this at the same time that all of the crowd is pressing around. And then finally, we get to raising someone from the dead. And it's interesting if you start thinking about those things. Well, as we begin to summarize it, you're going to see how this whole thing just sort of increases with the time and the magnitude. So this is a chart that you could put together, and not going to say that you would always think about how you would want to put it together, but we've already said that you want to do things like look for what's happening, look for things that are emphasized, look for things that are like the things that go on in our personal lives. We want to think about the who, what, when, where, why, and wherefore kind of questions, those journalistic questions. We want to do all of these things in the course of observation, and so we can begin to get some kind of way to get a handle on the big pieces that are going on here. So the list that you see up here, we have the miracle, and then the realm that is what kind of a miracle this is. We want to talk about who's involved, what it was that Jesus did, and then what happened as a result of what he did. And then the bottom line, really, because this is the test of their faith, we want to talk about what was happening with their faith as time went along. So the first miracle, we've already said, was what? The storm. And so the storm is stilled. We know that much. And then we have the demoniac who is delivered. And then we have this woman who is healed. And then finally a daughter who is raised. So that just sort of gives us a place to begin. We've already talked about those things. I don't have to spend a lot of time. So the storm miracle, if we were going to talk about what realm of, life and the things that we see around us, what would the stilling of the storm have to do with?
Stilling of situations in our life?
Well, he might intend us eventually to get around to thinking in those directions, but the actual story is a storm.
Dealing with the natural world.
All right, the natural world or the physical world. It's something interesting in the sense that who's got the right to monkey with things like the weather? Really God, right? We got people who get paid well, and it's their whole job in life to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, and they can't get it. So, and nobody, kicks them out because of that. I've sometimes wondered, as an engineer, I would never have gotten away with something like that. But if the train went over your new weld and it didn't hold and it dumped it on the side of the track, don't think that would go over, would it?
Not well.
Yeah. So it is the physical realm or the natural realm, the realm of nature. And so that's that one. However, we do have people, scientists and so forth, who study the natural world, and you might get somebody who says, if you had a little inside track and you knew the way things worked and so forth, could have maybe gotten that part right. And then you'd have some other folks who would look at the stilling of the storm and they might say, well, it's just an interesting coincidence. Those storms come up in a hurry, they quit in a hurry. Jesus just happened to wake up and say, peace, be still, the right time, and then it got still. If he'd have still been asleep, maybe it would have got still just as quickly. And if you're having a conversation with an unbeliever, he's going to throw all of these things, right? So what about the next one, the demoniac? What kind of world is he dealing with? And really, probably you could say a couple of.
The spiritual world.
Clearly the spiritual world, because there are demons, but also I think if somebody were acting like this demoniac today in our circles, what would be going through your mind and the mind of the doctors as they're sort of getting a handle on this? What would they say is his problem?
It's a mental health issue.
Okay, so we have those worlds to think about. And it's interesting because if you cast a demon out of somebody, that's not the same as feeding them some special drugs or something like that and telling them to go see their psychiatrist. It is really, truly a mental kind of appearance, but this one is a spiritual issue, and Jesus knows the difference. And he has cast out this legion. For one thing, you don't have a conversation with 1,000 figments of your imagination. But then we have the woman, and what's her problem? What world? It's a medical problem. And so with that medical problem, a physical problem, there's also undoubtedly the emotional baggage that would go with it. You got to remember when you had that kind of a medical situation, you were cut off from things like the worship of the Lord in the temple. You were not allowed to be around other people. The very fact that she's out there in the crowd, sort of able to get up against other people, and then for her, she would have to have pronounced herself unclean so that if she touched somebody, they would have to know that that would make them unclean.
Should have done social distancing.
Yeah, she lived her whole world like that for the last 12 years. Plus, certainly there's a financial component. She had spent everything that she had and gotten no better. And so just the weight of it, the emotional issues, the physical issues, the financial issues, she's dealing with a lot of different worlds right now. And then what about this little girl? What's her problem?
Right.
Yeah, she's dead. And I think it's interesting if somebody, you're talking to your local atheist, and he says, just a fluke of nature, a coincidence, Jesus happens to say something. I mean, he probably said 1,000 different things, and they just recorded this one because when he said it, the storm stopped. I could do that same thing on occasion. So that would be easy for somebody to say. Certainly, we have seen over and over again that modern day analysis of what's going on with people who are demon possessed and so forth, they would say, well, if you had the right kind of psychiatric care, I'm sure we could have done something about this poor guy and gotten him out from among those tombs, and it wouldn't have had to kill that many pigs. If he had some decent insurance and a doctor to go to, we could have taken care of him and fixed him right up. And what about this woman? This is before the good OBGYN care, and so if we had only had access to some of these kinds of things, we could have put her back in business. And so I don't know how Jesus solved it, but somehow he did. And but then we get to the last one, and no, the last one is the little girl, and we don't see people sort of heading over to the funeral home and bringing them back out, do we? This one's not one that you just explained. Now, you might have people say, well, I'm not sure she was really dead. And these people, unlike many of our folks today, were around a lot of people who died, and they knew when someone was dead. Jesus raises her from the dead, and he did, of course, not just somebody who had recently died like that. Eventually, he's going to do things like raise Lazarus after multiple days in the tomb, and then finally be raised himself from the dead. So there is kind of a progression that takes place. Physical, natural world. We can manipulate natural things to some degree, and then the mental, spiritual realm, and then this previously unsolvable physical problem. And then we raise somebody from the dead.
When I was in a women's Bible study way back in New York, it seems to me like it might have been myself. Somebody brought something up about somebody being healed from an illness or something. And I don't know if it was myself. It seems like it was. And I said, oh, they were lucky. And I was, they didn't pounce on me or what have you. But it is not luck. It's not coincidence.
And it's not as if Jesus promises to heal everybody. He was showing them who he was and what he could do. His real interest is what he was talking to them about in the parables, having faith in what he could do. It's not as if he came to heal everybody.
That's why he told them, don't go around telling people. He wanted them to know who he was, not as much as what he was doing.
I think the don't go telling people, that was, in the case of some, like the leper, it was because they needed to go through the proper channels to be declared clean. But in the case of many of these stories, he did not want everything to be accelerated to the point where he needed to be on the cross until the time was right. And that's why he did withdraw for a while. Well, let's look at the people involved. Who's involved in this stilling of the storm? Disciples are the primary characters, aren't they? And of course, Jesus. Really nobody else around. They might have witnessed some of it from the shore or something like that, but we're really talking about the disciples. And then we get to the story of the demoniac and who's involved in this story. Of course, we got Jesus and the disciples
And the demons,
and the demons
the pigs.
and the people. And, well, pigs, yes, but more so,
People watching.
yeah, the whole town worth of people. The people watching the pigs, and then the people who are brought into play because of that. And they're a huge part of this story before it's over. The pigs are the part people remember, of course, because as John Canterbury said, it's the first biblical or New Testament incident where we have suicide because of the pigs.
Oh,
If you didn't like that, you have to blame John. And I believe he did that at one of our annual meetings. So then we have Jesus and the woman and the disciples, but also there's a lot going on around there, and they get to witness what's happening. And I don't know what some of them might have thought about it as well, because in the condition she was in when she was unclean, she wasn't supposed to be around them. This was really a bold move on her part, because she could, especially to touch a rabbi like that, she could have been put to death for what she did. Then we have the daughter being raised, and who's playing the biggest part there? Certainly Jesus and the parents who were there, and then to some degree all of the disciples, but in particular the ones who went in. But who else is around?
Again, isn't it the crowd that's still there?
In fact, they've already had time for professional mourners to show up. And they're the ones who are just sort of laughing him to scorn. So we have increasingly large numbers of people involved as we make our way down through this, because we start with just Jesus and the disciples, and then we add in, some folks out watching the pigs and people who came to check on them, and then we've got this crowd, and then that crowd moves on down the street and picks up folks who were already at Jairus' place. He's a synagogue ruler, and so I'm sure he was well known and somewhat well-to-do. So now, how does the storm get stilled? He just says so, doesn't he? Not much to that particular one. And then the results, what happens when he says this word?
The storm stopped.
And it stops just like that. And then, of course, what happens, the other result is the disciples are looking at him, and they are just astounded, aren't they? To the point, really, of being afraid. Because who is this guy that he can just say the word and a windstorm? And mostly fishermen, they knew about this kind of stuff. If you got the ability to do something like that, seems like somebody you would want to, at the very least, stay on his good side, right?
Was the catching of the fish in the nets after that storm?
There were multiple
Well, when
net
it,
kind of things,
it
but
felt, you know, they went out and they said, you know, he said, let's go fishing. We've been fishing all night long.
yeah.
Was
There's,
that before or
that's,
after?
that's when they called them to be disciples. So there was one before, and then there's a really important one after he's raised from the dead, which reminds them back of what happened when he
Right.
called them as well. So Jesus speaks, everything happens. So what's the story with the demoniac?
He said, well, it was speaking again, was it?
He's speaking, but it's not just Jesus speaking.
That was an order.
There's also a little, what?
Back and forth.
A little conversation going on, isn't there? And that's how we get this inside information about what happened, and the fact that there were a legion of these demons. Have no idea how that works. I guess in a way I hope I never do. But you know, how you end up with 1,000 or 2,000 you know, demons living in you. But there's also this request, send us to the pigs. And that has caused a lot of people, I guess, a lot of questioning and maybe some heartburn, you know. Sure, PETA would not have appreciated what Jesus did there. And, you know, that he allowed those pigs to commit suicide, because an animal lover would have said, you know, how could you do a thing like that? Clearly, Jesus is making a statement about what's important and what isn't. He's a little more concerned about the people, but also the fact that they're in a territory that at one time was completely controlled by the Jews. And what are they doing raising thousands of pigs? You know, they weren't even supposed to have pigs. We're supposed to have pigs, eat pigs, deal with pigs, touch pigs, any of those things. That's hard for us to grasp because we like bacon and things like that, but he's apparently willing to let these thousands of pigs go over the cliff and drown. And the townspeople are not at all happy about this. This is their livelihood. And I don't know if what their background was, whether they were doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, or they had just come in and taken over Jewish territory. But clearly, there's a disconnect going on there someplace that they would have those pigs. So as we get a little further down that story, what happens to the man after the demons come out?
He was supposed to go tell what the Lord had done.
Well, first, he wasn't even in a position to communicate beforehand. The demons were, but the man wasn't. And he had run, knelt down, cried out with a loud voice. The demons did. You know, what do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of God, Son of the Most High God? And after they introduced themselves, and the man, what was his story before Jesus came? It says, no one was strong enough to subdue him. Verse 5, night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones, been bound with shackles and chains, and torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. So he was not the kind of a fellow that you could have any interaction with at all. And they tried to help him, or at least keep him from hurting himself and others. And when they come back and find this man, after the pigs have gone off the cliff, what did they find? You get down there in verse 15.
He was in his right mind.
In his right mind.
He had calmed down. He was sitting there.
Okay.
And the people were afraid because they didn't understand it.
And he's clothed, which he wasn't before. And they are frightened to see that kind of a change come over him, and they knew what had happened with the pigs. They'd been told about that. And so none of these things were true of the man before, were they? He was just a raving lunatic, cutting himself and naked and tearing off any restraints that they tried. And now he's just looked like a regular guy with a bunch of dead pigs. So,
I wonder how many people that are, possessed now, and there are, would really believe this story, that it could happen to them.
yeah, does not seem very prominent in our society. And you would expect really as much Christian influence as we've had in this country for a long, long time, that it wouldn't be. Although you go back before the Holy Spirit and you find out right there in Jerusalem, and in Galilee, you would have had meetings, church meetings of their day where a demoniac could walk right in and be part of the service. And apparently, nobody thought anything of it. Now, I've been...
You're not saying now, excuse me, that there are not any demon-possessed people. You're not saying that.
No, you did not hear me say that.
No, okay, I was inferring, sorry. Okay.
But you don't see much in our area. And yet, if you go to the right parts of the world, you will see a lot. And so, yes, it works very well. And the demons have free reign in some of these places. That's what happens with the demon-possessed man. What about with this woman?
Well, what's the answer under the column of their faith for the demon people?
We will get to that,
Oh, okay, I thought we already had it,
the last.
All Jesus had to do was stand there, and she touched him, and that
Right.
was what healed her.
So he's aware of what happens, but she really did all the going out there, and she decided what would work. She reaches out and she just touches his garment. And then how much time goes by before something good happens?
It was immediate.
It says it's immediate. And for somebody who's been dealing with something for years and spending all of her money on it, that's really a huge deal. It's as huge as the legion of demons. And there's a discussion that takes place, but we'll get to that when we get into the subject of faith. And then the daughter being raised, how did this come about?
It was him taking her by the hand and talking.
Which seems like an odd thing, doesn't it? I mean, I've been to an awful lot of funerals. Sometimes, I mean, last couple of years, I've gone through half a year at a time where I was at 2 funerals a week, probably, almost hospice chaplain kind of stuff. And I've seen an awful lot of people bent over caskets and speaking to the bodies that were in there. And I've not seen anybody get up. And no indication that the person who is in the casket is in any condition to hear the message that is being conveyed. And yet Jesus somehow is able to do this. He touches her and he speaks to her. And once again, how long does it take?
Immediate.
She just gets up. He just helps her up, and she's handed over to the parents. Now we get to the real reason to look at all this, and that is the faith. Well, the real reason is because we're talking about observations, and we're making observations, and we're trying to put them in a form where we can get a handle on this later. And so what's the condition, let's say the before and after situation with the disciples during the storm?
They're afraid and then they're not afraid, or their fear was gone.
So they thought they were going to die. That's what they asked Jesus. Don't you care that we're going to die? I don't know what kind of faith they had. They surely thought he was a miracle worker because of what they had already seen. But they didn't think he was going to keep them from dying on that boat. And then afterward, maybe they went from one extreme to the other. First, they're afraid they're going to die, and now they're afraid to be in the boat with somebody that's that powerful. And so that was an interesting situation. So Jesus gave them this little test. They didn't actually do that well on the test, except that they did come to Jesus for help. But as a result of taking them through this difficult time, the storm, they really obtained some faith, didn't they? So he says, and it's interesting because, different writers probably were in different places in the boat when some of these things happen. But he speaks of them as having had no faith. Sometimes it's little faith, but sometimes it's no faith. You didn't have any faith at all. Why are you afraid, he says in verse 40, do you still have no faith? And they were terrified and asked one another, who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him. So, what about the demoniac? And of course, it's not just the demoniac, the disciples are there. What happens with their faith?
They saw a change in his personality and his mannerisms.
They had seen people delivered before. Who's the one who really shows immediate faith in Jesus?
The man.
Yeah, the man, because he wants to go with them.
Well, I was thinking before he got healed. The demons,
Yeah.
they know exactly who he is. I mean, they might not have been willing to follow him, but they know exactly who he is. They say, what do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of Most High God? I beg you before God, don't torment me, verse 7 says, for he had told him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And so he has this conversation. These demons, they recognized Jesus immediately for who he was.
They believe and they tremble.
They believe and they tremble. So he recognizes Jesus immediately, and then as you noted, then he wants to follow him. He wants to become he wants to demonstrate his faith in Jesus by following him. And Jesus decides that he's got a job locally to take care of. What about,
Must have been kind of a picture, because they say a legion in the Roman army was 3,000 to 6,000 soldiers, and it was only 2,000 pigs. So they really had to, they really stormed them. It had to be kind of chaos.
that's a lot of pigs.
A lot of army.
So the woman, what's the situation with her faith and those around?
Her faith was great in the first place.
So faith was what?
Great or strong.
So she had enough faith to reach out and initiate this thing, which is interesting.
Yeah, she was kind of taking a chance.
And if you think about what she had been through, what's the normal kind of road that people take? If you have tried over and over again, you've tried for the last 12 years to get something fixed, does that usually cause you to have great faith?
No, your last,
You just get beat down. Yeah.
and your last thing they say is you go to Jesus, God, as the last resort.
But she had heard about Jesus and had some idea that this was going to be different. He had done some things for people that nobody else was able to do. And that's exactly the kind of healing that she was looking for.
She knew about Jesus, but never had gotten close enough to him before to do this then. I mean, did she
Yeah.
hear from just
I'm-
townspeople about?
I'm sure there was talk everywhere. Yeah, she would not have even been able to get close to people, so she would have to overhear other people talking. But the whole crowd got together because they were flocking to try and get something from Jesus. So she's the one who initiated it, and then specifically when Jesus left her, he said what to her about her faith?
Faith has made you, well, your faith is-
Yeah.
Your faith has healed you.
Has healed you.
Yep. Go in peace. Be healed from your affliction. Now, apparently the healing had taken place, but I think she needed the reassurance that this was a lasting thing and that he sanctioned it. Then we get to Jairus. And so what's Jairus' situation? It's an interesting one.
He didn't know that his daughter was dead when he was going to inquire of Jesus.
But he knew that she was on the doorstep. And what did he think Jesus was going to be able to do about that?
Heal.
Yeah. And so he was very enthusiastic about going to meet Jesus, ask him for his help. But then, if you read sort of between the lines there, what happens? Verse 35, while he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter's dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" So they certainly were not helpful in increasing his faith at that moment. But what you hear Jesus say makes you believe that what's going on with Jairus. verse 36.
Jesus tells him, don't be afraid, so.
Don't be afraid, only
and then
believe. So what do you think happened to Jairus?
He still believed.
I think he probably had a little hiccup of faith for Jesus to have to tell him, don't be afraid, only believe. I think he had complete faith that Jesus could heal his daughter while she was alive. And then came this news that she was dead. And then all of a sudden, well, now I don't know what to think. I've seen some people come through town and they've told me stories that Jesus has healed all kinds of crazy afflictions. Just saw this woman, with the 12-year malady, and she gets healed. But now my daughter's past the point of being healed. She's already died. And so he says, don't be afraid, only believe. And then he's protective of him. He says he doesn't let anybody else accompany him except for Peter, James, and John, James' brother. And they came to the leader's house. He saw the commotion, the people weeping and wailing. And so he makes sure that they get sent out while he goes in where the child is. And he took the child by the hand, said to her, little girl, get up. And then he hands her back over to the parents and asks for them to do something kind of normal, give her something to eat. So we have made our way through a big segment following another segment. And the long and the short is we have enough material put together that you could do a lot of things. This is just a slide from, if you went to his Living by the Book, the Gospel of Mark, you'll see he's got everything broken down, chapter 1, chapter 2 through 8. Who is this Jesus? And, during his service. And so that's the kind of thing you can do when you begin to put things together and come up with a way to sort of make some blocks so that we can come back to this text and have an idea what's going on. So we took a long time, but we haven't got to meet that many times over the last few weeks, so I guess that's a good thing for us. Let me get out of this. And I think if you